Good morning and welcome. Welcome today for our July Lay Legal webinar, African American Survivors in the Criminal Justice System. We thank you for attending today. And just as a reminder, we just want to let everyone know that we are recording. So if you would like to remain anonymous, just let us know so we will not say your name or your name will not be shown. But my name is Renee Glaze and I'm the Victim Service Specialist here at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. Today, I would like to present to you Whitney Walker. She is our Domestic Violence Policy Coordinator here. So I hope you enjoy. And here's Whitney.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in, as Renee said, to this month's webinar titled African American Survivors and the Criminal Justice System. My name is Whitney Walker, and I am the Domestic Violence Policy Coordinator for the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. So, once again, the title of this webinar is African Americans in the Criminal Justice System, Barriers to Reporting and Strategies in Aiding African American Survivors as they Navigate the Criminal Justice System. In order to understand and better help African American survivors navigate the criminal justice system, especially after enduring the life-altering trauma of sexual and domestic violence, this webinar will examine the evolution of African American cultural identity in the United States, provide a factual context on the African American sexual and domestic violence experience, provide insight on specific barriers African Americans face with the criminal justice system, and also provide strategies for when advocating and assisting African American survivors who face those barriers. As we all know, every survivor lives different experiences which may leave a lasting impact. And for some African American survivors, they will want you to know that society has taught us that we are aggressive, rude, and unyielding. We have come to believe these notions and convinced ourselves that we caused the harm. Beverly Gooden, founder of the LMA Foundation. LMA Foundation is a nonprofit organization that takes a firm stance against the public health crisis that is known as intimate partner violence. The evolution of the African American cultural identity. As Americans of African descent reached each new plateau in their struggle for equality, we reevaluated our own identity. African American slaves, as we were first introduced to the United States, this was our first cultural identity. We were an enslaved people. The slaveholder used these labels of Black and Negro, Spanish for Black, interchangeably and used throughout much of the Jim Crow Civil Rights era, as you will see later in the presentation. These terms were offensive, so African Americans chose the euphemism colored when they became freed, and this was their preference of choice for their cultural identity during that same era. The cultural identity changed once again to use the term Black, the symbol of power and revolution. It was provided more popular later in the 60s and the 70s, as these terms are still reflected in also names of dozens of organizations. Once again, to reestablish a cultural integrity, in the late 1980s, Jesse Jackson proposed African American, which, unlike some baseless color labels, it was to proclaim kinship with the historical land base. Now today, Black and African American terms of cultural identity are broadly used. But we also would like to note that when you are speaking with an African American survivor, you should listen to how they identify themselves. When speaking, is their identity when they tell you their story. You could also ask how they would like to be referred as well. The key goal is to make sure you empower them to make this choice for themselves. Do not make this cultural identity for them. The early history. A very small percentage of African Americans came over as indentured servants, as did many European whites. Indentured servants were people who signed a contract by which they agreed to work for a certain number of years in exchange for transportation to the new colonies. And once they arrived, they received food, clothing, and shelter. Surely enough, the institution of slavery was introduced with certain social controls in which slave owners amplified such laws as slave codes, and these were the first set of laws that made slavery formally introduced. Slave codes regulated the slave system to promote absolute control by the master and complete submission of the slave. In the first picture we have at the top right corner is a drawing of an enslaved woman enduring violence while being transported to what is now the United States. The bottom left picture, we have a picture of an enslaved person with an object tied over his or her mouth and an object over his or her neck to keep them from talking during the transportation, and also keep them chained to the person next to them, excuse me. These objects were made of iron and very heavy to carry. The two pictures on the right show how enslaved Africans were housed on the ships for the duration of the trip, which sailing from Africa to the islands and also the United States, which lasted for months. This is the America's beginning of the anti-Black ideology. The transatlantic slave trade was the biggest deportation in history. It is estimated that between 25 to 30 million people, men, women, and children, were deported from their homes, separated from their families, and sold as slaves in the different slave trading systems. Also, shock, disease, and suicide was responsible for the death of at least 1/6 of this population during the crossing. In the West Indies Islands, the survivors from the travel and transportation were seasoned before they arrived to the American colonies. During the seasoning process, they were taught the basis of English. So stripped away of their native tongue and language, they were drilled with routines and also the discipline of plantation life during this time. Black people were easily distinguished by their skin color from the rest of the populace, making them highly visible targets for enslavement. More so, the development of this belief that they were an inferior race and were a heathen to the culture made it easier for whites to rationalize Black slavery. So why is this important? Chattel slave or chattel slavery, which was commonly used in this area, is when an enslaved person who was owned for the duration of one's life and whose children and children's children are automatically enslaved. Chattel slavery was supported and made legal by European governments, which governed the transatlantic slave trade and also the American colonies. Under these laws, the enslaved person were identified as chattel, so a piece of property and a source of labor that could be bought and sold like an animal. Slaves were prohibited by law from learning to read and write, vote against, and also testify against whites in court. And during this time, rape was not generally considered a crime against enslaved women. So we just have a picture here on our left of what was acceptable and what was commonly known under chattel slavery, which was the whipping and the beatings of those who were enslaved. So now we're fast forwarding through history to the American Revolution period and America's newfound independence from Britain. And although some northern states were doing away with slavery during this time, the ratification, which needed the support of the southern colonies for the Constitution of the United States. So in 1788, with the ratification of the Constitution, it made slavery legally acceptable in the South as well in the North, as the Constitution standing alone and this is included without the amendments, and it did not make slavery or its practices illegal in this document. Furthermore, federal documents such as the 3/5 Compromise made it legally acceptable to count those enslaved as only 3/5 of a person, for only the purpose of slave owners having more representation at the General Assembly, which is now called Congress. In the Dred Scott decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a slave who has resided in a free state and or a territory was not entitled to his freedom, that African Americans could never be citizens of the United States. This is important because it shows, since our country's inception, that the United States created laws and systems that unjustly treated African Americans, and this treatment has continued to have a despairing impact today with little to no recourse. Now we're fast forwarding to the Civil War era. As a result of the Union victory, which is the North, in the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, nearly 4 million slaves were now free. The 14th Amendment granted African American citizenship by giving them due process of law. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed African American men the right to vote. I want to draw your attention back to the 13th Amendment, which is up in the top right corner, which says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. I want you to put a mental note, or a pin, as I should say, at the clause, except as punishment for a crime whereas the party shall have been duly convicted. Some scholars now today argue that this clause is the core foundation for mass incarceration, which I will talk about a little later. Furthermore, the Reconstruction period that preceded the Civil War was one of great disappointment and frustration for many African Americans at that time. For even though we had these new amendments and new provisions added to the Constitution, they were often ignored. The newly free enslaved Africans who were now considered citizens per se, they lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. The Southern states enacted Black codes, which were the foundation for Jim Crow laws, which I will later talk about. And much of these Black codes resembled slave codes. And as the government wanted to pass the Civil War era in hopes for a more perfect union, all of the Confederate leaders who were pardoned and regained their right to vote and also hold office. The rebirth of white supremacy in the South was accompanied by the growth of enforced racial separation and the forming of the Ku Klux Klan. They also passed Jim Crow laws, segregating Blacks and whites in almost all public places. A lot of this foundation came from the book, which is at the top left-hand corner, The Negro, a Beast in the Image of God, which was written by a professor at the time, Charles Carroll, and it was used as a scholarly reference to justify the racial separation laws known as Jim Crow laws. This book claimed that African Americans were more akin to apes than to human beings, and theorized that Blacks have been the tempers of Eve, who are the rapists and the murderers of that time. So if you see the depiction of how African Americans were drawn in the bottom left-hand corner, and then you see actual laws that were legally acceptable under Jim Crow that separated African Americans from whites. Another landmark case. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in our criminal justice system, ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that the doctrine of separate but equal was the law of the land and was legal. So during this time, as we're leading up to the civil rights era, I want to draw attention to the first picture in the top right, top left-hand corner. The Scottsboro boys were non-Black teens, ages 13 to 19, that were falsely accused of raping 2 white women aboard a train near Scottsboro, Alabama in 1931. by an all-white jury and an all-male jury, convicted these 9 boys within a 3-hour time span with limited evidence being provided. 8 of the 9 boys were sentenced to death. Once again, even though we gained the 14th Amendment due process of law, as you can see, because of the time and the cultural makeup and also what was legally acceptable, many people did not face that due process of law justly. The second picture I want to draw attention to you was from 1963, the Birmingham church bombing, which it killed 4 young African-American girls and injured many, many others. It was a bombing that took place before a church service on a Sunday. Although there was much evidence to identify the suspects at that time in the bombing, both given to local police and law enforcement and also the FBI, the suspects were finally brought to trial not until 2001 and 2002. So once again, even though we were essentially quote unquote protected under the 14th Amendment and given due process, as you can see from these, the legal system in the cases, it wasn't just due. Also at the bottom, just drawing attention to how many African Americans were treated during protests, as dogs were often drawn upon them. And also as we see a growing trend today of 450 Negro children being arrested in Birmingham. It's same correlation with many communities of color and juveniles being incarcerated today. And then we also see a sign of, again, police brutality must go. So with all these things going on, with the March on Washington led by Dr. Martin Luther King, we secured the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this forbade discrimination in voting, public accommodations, and employment. And it also allowed the government, under the highest attorney in the country, Attorney General, to deny federal funds to local agencies that practice such discrimination. But although the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1965, the country's predominantly African-American inner cities were swept out outbreaks of violence due to long-standing grievances of police insensitivity and brutality, and also the racism and systems and also of the time. This was also accompanied by inadequate educational and recreational facilities, high unemployment, poor housing options, and high tax rates at that time. The fighting that took place were mainly between African American youth and law enforcement. The most serious disturbance occurred in Watts area of Los Angeles, California in 1965, and this is depicted in the Times cover. So we fast forward 5 decades later, many African-American cities are still plagued with the same long-term grievances as was pretty depicted and widespread in 1965. Here's a picture of Baltimore during a protest for police insensitivity and brutality in 2005. So I know you all are wondering, so what is the connection and how do we get here? The United States incarcerates more of its citizens than any other nation in the world. Research has shown, and national studies to date has also expressed, that the increase in the jail and prison population went from less than 200,000 in 1972 to 2.2 million today, and those are people actually housed in jail. The United States has only 5% of the world population, but nearly 25% of its prisoners that constitutes globally. So, explanation and context is how we got here. In the 1980s, as lawmakers campaigned to get tough on crime, also described as the war on drugs, America built a new prison system every 2 weeks and still could not meet the demands for prison beds. Even though violence had fallen by more than 51% in 1991, and although the crime rate had dropped steadily to about half of what it is previously, today nearly 7 million people in this country are incarcerated, on probation, or on parole. So if you think about the 70 million people, and then you look at more than 60% of those 7 million people are people of color. The politics of fear and anger fueled the tough on crime policies, and which backed the war on drugs. So the war on drugs included mandatory minimum sentencing, extraordinarily harsh and racially motivated penalties for minor drug offenses, and this explosion in life sentences without parole. For example, the use of higher minimum sentences was used for crack cocaine, which were found primarily in Black and brown communities, contribute to the 6% of the 7 million people incarcerated due to these people being people of color. Whereas powder cocaine, which was often used in white communities often received lesser of a minimal sentence. So furthermore, based on this rapid increase and this phenomenon that scholars support of mass incarceration, a new study was shown of the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for born in 2001. So we're talking about juveniles, and we're talking about the youth. We're talking about people that are in high school now, that are actively in Instagram, Snapchat, and just living their daily lives. So based on that research, it shows that 1 in 3 Black male youth and 1 in 18 Black female youth are likely to be incarcerated in his or her lifetime. So as you can see, the likelihood of imprisonment is far greater due to this clause going back to the 13th Amendment, except for the punishment of the crime is related and connected to what is now known as mass incarceration. So I know what all of you are thinking, why are the statistics and the stats so high? African Americans are more oftenly stopped and questioned, searched than whites. African American suspects and defendants are more likely to be the targets of police and prosecutorial misconduct, such as racial profiling. All of us, including judges and jurors, are well as lawyers and police are subject to unconscious racial biases. So research has shown us that due to implicit biases, that's what increased the context, or the propensity, I should say. So for example, a study was conducted in Chicago that showed that law enforcement are much more likely to stop Black drivers than white or Latino drivers. Another national study shows that African Americans are, once again, only 13% of the American population, but they are the majority of innocent defendants wrongly convicted of crimes and later exonerated. As shown in this graph, we see the racial disparity in law enforcement's propensity to target African Americans for this context. So we are often left to my thought to wonder, the criminal justice system, how volume of contacts with people of color stemming from implicit bias contribute to the injustices felt in many communities of color. So because of the not so friendly or welcoming history and systems in the United States that African American communities have experienced, as expected, many African American survivors have barriers when trying to survive and seek help and security from either law enforcement, legal systems, or even sometimes advocates and the service providers. And here are some of the reasons why. Distrust of law enforcement, of the criminal justice system as a whole or in part, social services and also social service programs due to the history of racism and classes in the United States. lack of service providers that look like them or share the common experiences that may be that can help assist them in navigating the criminal justice system, or a lack of culturally or logistically appropriate services that can also help aid that system when they're navigating. It could be an issue of legal status in the United States of the survivor or also the person that caused the harm. Fear experiences will reflect on or confirm the various stereotypes placed on their culture, their race, or ethnicity, and oppression that causes re-victimization. African American communities tend to be suspicious of both law enforcement and the courts. And once again, as the common theme has been threaded through this presentation so far, the distrust is rooted in historical injustice and is fueled by contemporary controversies. It is hard for African American survivors to rely on law enforcement, the criminal legal system for safety and protection, and essentially these systems are set forth to pursue justice and to protect and serve and to help the population, right? But once again, this shared history of disenfranchisement and police brutality and sensitivity often results in a collective battle against these oppressive systems and racism that African Americans still face today. And because of this battle of racism and oppression in these systems, it often overrides the violence of the domestic and sexual violence that African American survivors experience. A growing body of scholarship and research suggests that implicit racial biases, as I've stated before, unconsciously is associated with just the human race, mankind, should I say, and it makes up these implicit bias about various racial groups. And because of these implicit biases, they are often activated when individuals must make fast decisions with imperfect information. So going back to the system of law enforcement, or even the systems of the legal system in the courts, many race-neutral policies that are well-intended to be race-neutral policies and laws have a desperate racial impact because of the implicit bias. For example, as in the previous slides back, we showed the police stops. Or also another example is the stop, question, and frisk. And these propensities and contacts with African Americans, it has a disproportionately impact. Also another type of race-neutral policy, but have a racially desperate impact on communities of color, in particular African American communities, are the plea bargain guidelines. So all of these contribute to this barrier or a fear that African American survivors may have when suggested to reach out to law enforcement or seek the courts for some type of recourse. Extensive research has shown that in such situations, the vast majority of Americans of all races associate African Americans with adjectives such as dangerous, aggressive, violent, and criminal. Since the natural law natural makeup of law enforcement frequently requires for police officers and law enforcement to make snap judgments about the danger posed by suspects and their criminal nature of their activity, unsubconsciously, racial associations are influence the way that officers may perform or do their job. Law enforcement policies, like I say, such as stop, question, and frisk, is just one of those ways of how research has shown that the implicit bias is intertwined when they're trying to perform their job duties. So a good question is, if we're here to serve, how can we do better? So here are some strategies and tips when assisting African American survivors who are navigating the criminal justice system. Okay. Educate yourself on the issue. So before you get involved in any issue, make sure you understand what the cause and what is trying to be achieved. So, you know, doing your own research. Make sure you are doing your best. Work on your own habits and beliefs. So essentially making sure you are doing your best to work on the problem and not contribute to it. Take time to listen. The survivor knows best about his or her experience as an oppressed person of color. Listen to their narrative and recognize that this may be different from your own, and know that that is okay. Self-reflections of your own privilege and seeing communities of color with the intersectional lens, which all of this I will break down and get into a little bit later. Take action no matter how small. Those closest to a problem are often the closest to a solution. And all of these are going to be further explained later. But before we get that, so the first part was educating yourself on the issue. So, okay. See, first, let's look at the population that we serve, right? So we're educating ourselves. According to a national study, research, Black women have been physically abused by a partner during their lifetime. So the research shows about 41% of Black women will be physically abused by their partner in their lifetime. And that information was given by a national study. So another national study shows that between 2003 and 2012, at the rate of 4.7 per 1,000, African Americans had the highest rates of inter-partner violence compared to whites, which were at 3.9, and the Hispanic, another community of color, at 2.3. $5.2 million African American women will have a contact of sexual violence over their lifetime. 2.4 million African American men will have a contact of sexual violence over his lifetime. African American women are 3 times more likely to die at the hands of a partner or ex-partner than any other members of other racial groups. And also, in the majority of these cases, the African American woman knows the person who caused the harm. It was an intimate partner. Also, LGBTQ people of color are nearly 4 times as likely to experience physical violence throughout their life. So now that we know these statistics and we have a foundational concept of how the cultural identity of African Americans evolved from being enslaved chattel person to the Negro to colored until being Black to being African American, and the constant oppressions and racism that still happens today. Another way is to looking at how we can address harm is through restorative justice. And some of you may be thinking, what is restorative justice and what does that look like? So restorative justice is a restorative processes bringing those harmed by crime or conflict and those responsible for that harm into communication, enabling everyone affected by a particular incident to play a part in repairing that the harm and finding a positive way to move forward. Restorative justice should focus on repairing the actual harm. It should be a volunteer process, safe and accessible with impartial facilitators. and respect for all participants. Some of these processes may look like, as you may have heard or may not have heard, is it includes a victim-offender mediation, a restorative conferencing, family group conferencing, victor or offender groups, and peacemaking circles. So once again, restorative justice looks at focus on repairing the harm versus finding the quick way to punish or seeking justice through incarceration. And as we recognize and also sit in the possibility of what restoring harm may look like, we recognize that this may only be for some and this may not be for all. And it's ultimately up to the survivor to be empowered to seek that recourse to be restored from the trauma they experienced. And also we recognize and understand that the safety and the security of the survivor is always a top priority. So this is things that is definitely kept in mind. But an introduction to this concept can be explored and also could very well may potentially be a practice in the long run. And in the process, what does that look like, right? So the process, you learn about the offender, or in the restorative justice model, we would like to say the person that caused the harm, and you put that face to that harm, right? The victim or the survivor, as I would like to say, get to ask questions of that offender. They express their feelings and the needs after the crime or the harm that was committed. They receive an apology and an appropriate reparation. And the reparation may not be incarceration, especially given the fact of the African American community, how they have that uneven and unequal relationship with the criminal justice system. This is an opportunity where you can educate offenders about the effects of their offenses in hopes that it won't be done again, right? You sort out any existing conflicts. You be a part of the criminal justice process. And the criminal justice process, once again, may look different. And it gives them an opportunity to put that crime or that harm done upon them behind them. Okay. So, Miss Typo on Lens, sorry about that. But we're talking throughout the conversation and this webinar. We've talked about implicit biases and our racial or racist makeup of the foundation of our country until now, right? And so we're getting to this portion of intersectionality and what does that look like and what does that mean? So I have a wheel up here with various different adjectives that defines us, or not necessarily defines us, but contribute to who we are, our very being. And with that, African-American survivors of intimate partner violence or sexual assault and violence have often experienced multiple forms of trauma, including that trauma that they experience from sexual domestic violence. So African-American trauma survivors seeking help, many of these services or interventions take a colorblind approach to assisting these survivors. And as a result, persons of color are often not seeking or receiving the full services that they could receive because of this very colorblind approach. So acknowledging and valuing survivors' differences and appreciation for their life experiences, no matter how indifferent from yours, and recognizing that when going through systems such as law enforcement or the legal system, you will often recognize, if you put this lens and take a step back and you look at the history and look at how race may play a factor, or gender or social economic status, you may realize that this interaction may be quite different from your own realities or your own experiences with these various same systems. So if we're looking from things from a intersectional lens, in the sense of people's different experiences, people's different cultural identities, how the way the foundation of the United States, or I would say our country, was formed, when we take a look back and recognize how the involvement, or how African Americans evolved from being chattel slavery to now a freed but very oppressed people, we also have to take a look and reflect on what are maybe our own biases, or implicit biases, or unconscious bias that we may have when we're assisting survivors who want to just, at the end of the day, survive, be safe, and have stability. So the first thing will be a intro into personal reflection, and how do we do that, and how do we recognize that? We can address that and look at stereotypes. So I put this up here, so please remove the label. And it's quite ironic when we looking at things in an intersectional lens, and how that differs from actually having a stereotype or generalization or implicit bias, as we'll get into, to remove that and just see someone for who they really are. So stereotypes. So I've been using lingo such as stereotypes and implicit bias interchangeably throughout this presentation. So here I'll give you some examples and also some context of what a stereotype, commonly referred to as an implicit bias, what that means. So a stereotype is a fixed general image or set of characteristics that a lot of people believe may represent a particular type of person, thing, or a group, right? So we'll examine the stereotypes of African American women, right, and how that relates or interplay when they seek services from the system, from the criminal justice system, or even if they're sitting across from us and they're trying to seek a service and recourse with the agency to end their trauma of sexual and domestic violence. So, example, the first common stereotype that African American women experience or are labeled as is the mammy, and this is framed as a sexless, selfless nurturer. So this may be a woman, or the common stereotype associated with this woman may be a older African American woman, and she may be coming to seek some type of justice for being sexually assaulted, but because we just see or generally make a statement of seeing her as just a nurturer, we don't see her as a true victim, someone that needs assistance and needs our attention and needs our care. Another one would be the Jezebel, right? Or Jezebel, as it should say, an overly sexualized, promiscuous Black woman. So this is another stereotype that hinders and prevents African American women from seeking assistance with law enforcement or the legal system, because maybe based on how the way they dress, it could be based on how many kids they may have. It's all these different generalizations throughout history that has been placed on the African American women that limits who they are as a person and limits their visibility. And because their visibility is limited down to these stereotypes, it's hard or difficult for people who are whose job is to protect or serve or to assist, actually assist these victims. Another stereotype is sapphire, or the angry Black woman, as it's called angry modern day. So this is often used when Black women are often emotional or assertive, or standing firm on what has happened to them in their experience. And so often with the angry Black women stereotype, they're depicted as the criminal, or they're depicted as the person that caused this harm, or, you know, because they were quote unquote loud, or because they were talking with their hands, or maybe moving their necks, they may be difficult to deal with. The next one is welfare queen. And this is just stigmatizing, and it labels the single Black mother as if she is, you know, either lazy or she's not doing anything to protect herself or even protect her children. And this can be interplayed in another system, in the sense of maybe you may have a survivor that has to deal with child protective services. So if this is a stereotype associated with a single Black mother, how do we overcome that? How do we combat that? How do we, you know, once again, not generalize and go back to who this woman really is and what services they really need? So now we have the stereotypes of the African American men. The Shambo. This is a lazy, irresponsible, carefree type of man, in the sense that he just has no care in the world. He doesn't even have the mental capacity to even think for himself. The next, so therefore, because he has, before I get into the next stereotype, so going back to Shambo, so because he has no mental capacity to think for himself, he's automatically a criminal. That's just what he's prone to do. He just wasn't thinking, so he's just automatically the suspect, right? Because he has no way of thinking what's right from wrong. The Mandingo is animal in nature, who passions, emotions, and ambitions are almost wholly has a sexual instinct. So this, in the sense that they only are, everything that they do and how they operate is just associated with some type of sexual interest. So therefore is another way to look at a African American men victim and immediately criminalize him, because once again, he's only after, and all of his motives, his whole being is for a sexual instinct. The next one is the savage or predators, and I use the term predators because it was often used in the 90s to help justify and also stamp African American men as those who are just innately just was born, raised to commit crime. So they're predators. Also, it gives you a very like childlike mind, once again, having African American men not being able to think for himself. So he just roams with no purpose. Therefore, since he has no purpose, he must more likely is committing a crime. The last one is a thug, and it's the misconception that African American men are criminals warned of suspicion. And so all of these stereotypes, especially for men, even if you have a African American young boy or a teenage youth seeking services that may be a victim of sexual domestic violence, if you have these typical stereotypes or generalizations of the African American men, it will be difficult for you to look at this person as who they are, and difficult for you to look at the service that they may need. So microaggression. So I'll just read off some of the comments on this particular slideshow. It says, "You don't act Black. I don't see color. What are you? Oh, I'm not a racist. Gay? Are you even legal? You seem smart for a Black girl." Or, "I have Black friends. Why do you sound white?" So some of you may have heard of the term and some of you may have not, and you may be thinking, microaggressions, what is that? So racial microaggressions are the brief and everyday sized insults, indignities, and denigrating messages sent to people of color by well-intentioned people who are unaware of the hidden messages being communicated. So well-intended people can be other communities of color. Well-intended people can be, white people as well. Research shows and supports that most people harbor unconscious bias. So the unconscious bias, as we previously learned, is the generalization of the stereotypes. So unconscious biases and prejudice that leak out in many interpersonal situations and decision-making points. So in other words, getting people to realize that they are acting in a biased manner is an enormous task, because on a conscious level, they see themselves as a fair-minded individual who would never consciously discriminate or are generally not aware of their own biases. And their self-image of being a good moral human being is aligned and assailed with them, and in quite a conflict of them realizing and acknowledging that they possess biased thoughts for themselves or attitudes and feelings that harm people of color. So you may be thinking, what does these messages, or what does this microaggression behavior or habit look like? These messages may be sent verbally. So maybe, why are you being so dramatic? Or why are you talking so loud? So if you're, for example, if you're speaking with an African-American survivor and they may be, talking with their hands, or even, speaking in a way of moving their neck, by asking them, why are you being so dramatic, could be a slight microaggression. Or if, why are you talking so loud? That type of thing. Another way a message of this can be sent is clutching of one's purse more tightly when you see a person of color approaching, or hand gestures to signal control over emotion. So once again, going back to maybe speaking with the African-American survivor, or if the African-American survivor is in the contact of speaking with law enforcement or the police, waving those hand gestures to, either calm down or maintain some type of self-control can be a microaggression, especially if, they're just being who they are. Environmentally, symbols like the Confederate flag or using American Indian mascots is a way that these microaggressions can play out. And once again, such of these communications are usually outside the level of consciousness awareness of perpetrators or the people that do these microaggressions. So you may be saying, okay, I learned about stereotypes, implicit biases, microaggressions. How do I not do that? Or how can I move forward? Or if I'm speaking with an African-American survivor and, I'm telling him or her or they to go to law enforcement, and keeping in mind all the history and the things that makes these systems work, what can I do to be a better advocate or a better assistant or a better person willing to help someone in need? You want to ask and listen. So going back to looking at things from an intersectional lens, seeing that person for who they are, in the sense of, their race, their experiences, their backgrounds, their perspectives, looking and understanding, doing that self-reflection of, is this a general stereotype that I may be feeling about this person, and also being aware of microaggressions that is unintended. I put this as diversity is the mix and inclusion is making all those things work. So doing that self-reflection when talking with a survivor and helping a survivor and also assisting them and aiding them in navigating the criminal justice system, inclusion is a mix that all of those things work, right? So before assisting the survivor or any survivor from an oppressed community, ask yourself. So just going back to what that looked like, and then it could be in the sense of ally or an accomplice, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So as you're moving from being an ally to an accomplice, you want to ask yourself these questions. Throughout history and things that you've learned after you educated yourself and got familiar with a particular community or issue, right? You want to ask and reflect who thrives and who dies in this situation. So if you're, talking to an African-American survivor and your first common response to some type of harm experienced through domestic or sexual violence is to go to law enforcement and criminal justice system, you want to ask yourself, given the history of how our country and the foundation of America was formed, who thrives and who usually dies in this situation? Another question could be, or another self-reflection could be, who body matters? When you look throughout history and you see the cultural identity evolution of African Americans, and then you see what is going on constantly now with mass incarceration, you want to look at yourself and think, who body actually matters? Who has value and who has, who's empowered to say what is what when interacting with the criminal justice system? You want to think about who history survives, in the sense, if you think back going to the cultural identity and the cultural makeup of African Americans, given that they were stripped away of their native tongue, given that they were disciplined to be slaves, given that they had Jim Crow laws and all these strict oppressive systems, is it warranted, or even if it's ideal to see that their actual history or who they are as a people have it survived? You want to ask yourself, who gets policed? Given the research that was provided earlier, because we all have implicit biases, and because those implicit biases plays out in the criminal legal justice system, whether it is in law enforcement or the courts, you have to ask yourself, who gets policed? When we have the mass incarceration rate at 60% of people of color, of the 7.2 million people incarcerated, it's clear to see that communities of color get policed. So therefore, African American survivors will be very reluctant to interact with law enforcement. Once again, who is safe or socially accepted? Given the history that has happened in the United States and what's currently going on, you want to ask yourself that. And who is often missing when policies, narratives, systems are being developed? So as you can see, since the inception and foundation of the United States, African Americans weren't even considered a whole person. So because we have that foundation and that core concept ingrained in all of our systems, that also what make up the criminal justice system and criminal legal system, from Supreme Court cases that upheld this ideology to now what is mass incarceration, that has also had a desperate impact racially on communities of color, in particular African American communities. You have to ask yourself, were African Americans at the table when these policies and procedures were even developed? And because they weren't at the table, what kind of impact does this have on the survivor seeking those same systems that did not provide that community justice? So, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Ally and accomplice. So, since we went through things throughout this presentation to have self-checkpoints of asking yourself questions of when you're helping and assisting African-American survivor as they navigate the criminal legal system, as we can see throughout history that supports that the criminal legal system didn't provide justice for the African-American community as it did others. Really empowering yourself, how can I be an ally, and moving from allyship to accomplice? So allies are people who recognize the uneven privilege they receive from society, patterns or of injustice, and take responsibility for changing these patterns. Being an accomplice means more than just understanding the problem, but being a person with a plan to solve it. It is about understanding that you, as an ally and potentially someone with privilege, have worked to create a foolproof plan to help systems of oppression. Being an accomplice is more than just listening to others talk about the struggle. It is about solidifying a course of action that helps you commit to undoing it. Being an accomplice is about risking your voice in order to elevate those who are often silent. So take action. You may see, what does that look like, right? Especially if you're coming from a place of being an advocate and advocacy and passionately working and loving what you're doing and genuinely with your whole heart wanting to support and aid African-American survivors. Taking action, going back to, it could be no matter how small, right? So moving from allyship to be an accomplice could be holding people accountable for their racist or anti-Black and brown antics, holding people in privileged positions accountable for their passivity on anti-LGBT rhetoric, or calling out misogyny when it comes up in conversation. So, in part, right, and then in closing, given that we come from such a place of separation, oppression, victimization that is still very well going on today in all forms. And if we truly, truly want to end sexual and domestic violence, I go back to the mission of the Arizona Coalition to end sexual domestic violence. We have to dismantle oppression in all forms. And this can only be done if we do it together, no matter what your background is, where you come from, who you are as a person. This can be achieved if we all come together and we all recognize that in our difference, that's where we find power, and in our difference, that's how we can make change. We come from in hopes to provide that unity, in hopes for those who are often silent are now empowered to speak and have that voice. And we must do this together. And so in closing, I just ask that when helping or aiding an African-American survivor, that you ask yourself these questions and you do your self-reflection, and that you are empowered to do research and do history on the cultural identity of African-Americans, and also explore those ideas of looking at things from an intersectional lens, and moving from allyship to being an accomplice, and challenging those people and also those systems who want to continue to oppress and silence those communities of color or those who identify in marginalized groups. So we've come to the conclusion of this presentation quite early, as it has been an hour and 10 minutes or so. I just want to say thank you for listening and for tuning in. And if you have any questions, now we have time. Once again, I'm Whitney Walker, Domestic Violence Policy Coordinator, and this was brought to you on behalf of the Arizona Coalition Against Sexual Domestic Violence. If you want to ask questions now, we have time to talk and discuss, or if you feel more comfortable with emailing me your questions, my email is whitney@acescv.org. Okay. So yeah, well, we'll leave it up a few more minutes for questions. So I hope that you enjoy the presentation.